Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel and my review of Newcastle United's 3-2 defeat to Manchester City at St James's Park on Saturday evening. I know that there's been a lot of sort of negativity after another defeat, late defeat. It's a sort of similar story with Newcastle having the lead, not struggling to see out a game and struggling to match momentum of an opposition side. And yeah, I absolutely understand why there is an argument for this being another defeat similar to Chelsea in the Cup. Obviously, it was on penalties. Everton with a late collapse, and PSG in the Champions League, which obviously was a draw. But I see complete difference in this game. Newcastle were back to their sort of pressing best, back to their energetic best at times. They were organised. There was a clear plan and a clear identity in place, which looked more like what you expect from an Eddie Howe Newcastle United side. Whereas in previous weeks, I think that wasn't the case. I think we should go right back to the start and have a look at why Newcastle started the game and how they came back into it, and then obviously how they let it slip at the end. So the very start of the game, I thought Newcastle actually started quite well. There was a spell of decent possession in the first sort of 10-15 minutes. They had an offside goal from Sean Longstaff, which was rightly chalked off. Now I understand sort of both sides of this argument because obviously lots of criticism of the linesman for not putting the flag up and that causing Ederson's injury from the clash with Longstaff. I understand that completely, but at the same time it was also not close enough, not far away enough, I should say, for it to be obvious that it was an offside, and it's one of those where you would look at VAR to go and just double check that it was offside. So I understand both elements of that argument, but from a Manchester City perspective it must be frustrating given that they also lost John Stones to a similar incident, given that Ederson had to go off injured in the first couple of minutes, and then Newcastle had another chance, missed it before Ederson went off, obviously probably a result of his injury. He lost the ball to Miguel Almiron, and then Bruno Guimaraes had an air shot at goal. Newcastle missed a good opportunity. Then Manchester City started to dominate the ball, started to find the spaces in between the lines from Phil Foden, as they did in August at the Etihad Stadium. That was the story of the game. Kyle Walker was pushed up again, and Newcastle couldn't really deal with that, and it was a problem for Newcastle. And then Bernardo Silva scores first, and it looks like it's going to be a long night from there. Newcastle were second best to every ball. There were spaces being exploited by a brilliant Man City side, and I think there is an element that you can say where that's always going to happen against a team like Man City, that they're going to find those spaces because they are that good. But Newcastle weren't really doing enough. I spoke on the True Faith instant reaction last night about where I think, there was a lot of criticism of Dan Burn for the first goal. I don't think Dan Burn is at fault himself. I think it's a failure of the current system without a number 6. If you don't press high and you don't win the ball in midfield and the defence isn't as high, it has to drop off. The spaces that are exposed between the lines in midfield and down the left, because Burn comes inside to make a back three. That's what he did last season. That's why he's at left back as almost like a third centre back, to make defending the box much easier. So that was exposed, and Man City took the lead, and Newcastle looked like they're facing a very long night. And then suddenly they're back into it with a brilliant goal from a fantastic Bruno Guimaraes pass into Alexander Isak, and Isak looks back to his firing best again. What finish that was! 14th goal of the season so far. Given that he's been through quite a few weeks of looking like he's not back to his full fitness, having issues with his groin, now it looks like he's firing again, and that's really, really good. That's a really, really big thing for Newcastle, especially when you consider that in January the whole discourse has been about how Chelsea need a striker, how Arsenal need a striker, how Manchester United need a striker, and Newcastle are sitting on, for me, behind Haaland, the second best striker in the country, and I think that is such a privileged position to be in. And given that in the last couple of videos we've been talking about the need to sell players, I think Isak is the one player who you wouldn't be able to replace directly because of his runs, his movement, his energy, his dynamism, everything about him. When Newcastle play at their best, it's invariably with Isak up front, because he creates space for those around him, he causes havoc for defenders, but he's also got the technique and the ability to create something from nothing, but also score goals himself. And that was on show there. And then straight away, 2 minutes later, almost a carbon copy, but from Anthony Gordon, another player who struggled for fitness and form recently, looked back to his best again yesterday and against Sunderland. So real positives in that sense, that two of the best players that Newcastle have finally look like they're sort of stepping up again and coming out of what was a really difficult few weeks last month when Newcastle's form was really, really bad. Obviously, this defeat is another one. It's, I think, 6th defeat in 7 games. They've lost their last 4 in the league, but it wasn't the same as those December games. It was a complete difference. Newcastle did look back to their best. They looked stronger. They looked more organised. They looked like they were firing again in every single sense. I thought Bruno, I've seen a few criticisms. I tweeted this morning saying that I think Newcastle will get top 6, or I'm still fairly confident Newcastle will get top 6, and I'll explain why in a minute. But a couple of things that have come back are that Bruno wasn't as good as I said he was, and I think that that's a bit harsh. He didn't keep the ball perfectly every time because Manchester City put pressure on in the second half, which again we'll get to in a second. But he was also defensively brilliant. He put his body on the line. He was also, I think, struggling with a bit of a hamstring injury for much of the second half, which is something we'll have to wait and see on over the next couple of weeks when Newcastle have no games. So there's a chance to sort of take a breather for everybody now. Manchester City then took a bit of initiative. If you listen to Anthony Gordon's interview after the game, he speaks about Eddie Howe telling them not to sit back and telling them to go for the third goal. And I think there were spells where they looked like they could, but Manchester City put more pressure on. Obviously, when City stepped it up, Newcastle didn't really have an answer, and that was more evident when Kevin De Bruyne came on and really changed the game. And his quality, both in terms of his equaliser and then the pass for Oscar Bobb's goal, who also came on and made a difference with his energy and his impetus as well. Newcastle didn't have an answer for that, and when you have no substitutes on the bench, when you have a bench as weak as Newcastle did yesterday, and Manchester City are bringing on players like De Bruyne and Bob, that's going to make a difference. And Newcastle, if they had Joe Linton on the bench, if they had Joe Willock, if they had Harvey Barnes, if they had Callum Wilson, if they had Sandro Tonali, these are all players who they've been missing for a long time. And yes, I understand that if you keep talking about fatigue and you keep talking about injuries and you keep talking about lack of options, it becomes tiresome. But at the same time, when you don't have those players, and Manchester City do, you can't act on momentum. You can't change the game, and your existing players get tired. By the last 20 minutes, it looked like Isak was absolutely dead on his feet. And I think if Wilson's on the bench, as we saw last season, they dovetailed so well, not together on the pitch mainly, but because one would come off after 70 minutes, the other one would come on, and Newcastle had a momentum change and a player who could score a goal. That doesn't happen in this game, and Newcastle really look like they're gonna struggle for the last 20 minutes, and obviously it told. Yes, it's the same issue again. Newcastle can't hold on to a lead, but I think I'm so much more confident about how Newcastle are going to go forward now. I know there wasn't particularly good injury updates from Eddie Howe in the pre-match presser, but with a 2-week break before Fulham in the Cup and then Villa away, and then more favourable fixtures in February when players are likely to be coming back. I mean, Joe Willock, I think we will see in February. Elliot Anderson, I'm not quite sure on. Harvey Barnes, I think we'll see in February. Callum Wilson, we might see by the end of this month. These things, Joe Linton will probably see in February, March time. So there will be players coming back, and you would imagine with the fixtures dying down, there only being one fixture a week again, that Newcastle will be able to find their form. I do still think that the issue again with the lack of number 6 was shown quite clearly again by Phil Foden picking up those spaces and De Bruyne picking up those spaces in the way that Morgan Gibbs-White did. That's becoming more of an issue, and teams have worked out how to exploit Newcastle. You don't let them press in midfield, and then you hit behind Bruno, and then you you find the space that Dan Burn leaves on the right of midfield from the opposition's perspective, and then that becomes much easier to get through Newcastle. I think that is an issue. I think Newcastle do need to look at that, and they will look at trying to get number 6. And Calvin Phillips was obviously unused substitute yesterday for Manchester City. I'm not sure that we'll see the end of that deal yet. I think that there's still some way to run with it, but Newcastle's hands are still tied with FFP, so that is something to have in mind. But overall, I think that this is a poor result and a disappointing result, and given that Newcastle are in the same position as they have been a number of times this season, I think they've conceded 15 goals in the last 15 minutes of games this season, as opposed to 13 goals in the first half of games, which shows, a continuing issue. I understand that, but this is by no means the same as the December fixtures. This is by no means a crisis. I think if you go up against the Manchester City side with Kevin De Bruyne on the bench and you don't have any substitutes, that's going to happen to you. But I do think Newcastle look more like the team that they are, and they'll have players coming back. And I think this top 6 battle, top 4 might be tough. Top 5 obviously might be a Champions League spot. I don't think this season is over by any stretch of the imagination in terms of chasing Europe. And I still think Newcastle are very much in the top 6 race. I know that might split opinion at the moment. I know that fans are a little bit disappointed, frustrated by the same themes. But this is a much different performance and a much different result to those in December. Thank you very much for joining me again. Please like, share and subscribe if this is what you like, and I'll be back later this week with another video, another transfer update, some more thoughts on what happens at Newcastle. Obviously the big game for the women later today against Manchester United in the Cup. And yeah, catch you next time. Cheers.